Welcome to the local edition. I'm Jason Dole, and we're diving into a story that affects hundreds of thousands of Pennsylvanians, especially those who live in rural areas and who are still waiting for reliable high speed internet. A massive $42 billion federal program was supposed to bring fiber optic internet, the fastest and most reliable option for internet, supposed to bring it to places like northern Crawford County and other underserved communities, but recent changes from the federal government could shift that promise. Joining us now is Charlotte Keith, investigative reporter for Spotlight PA, who's been following this evolving story and the impact of these new rules and how they could affect broadband access in the Commonwealth. Charlotte, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
So, first, if you could just give us the basics, like where'd the idea for this $42.5 billion broadband program come from? What was it supposed to do?
Yeah, so this was something that was included in this huge infrastructure package that was passed in bipartisan fashion at the end of 2021. And this funding for broadband specifically was really a response to the way that the pandemic had underscored how essential it is to have fast and reliable internet to be able to fully participate in modern life. There were images of kids doing their homework in McDonald's parking lots, those kinds of things. And that really kind of gave this push to sort of figure this out once and for all. So it's a huge investment in broadband, really trying to focus on mainly like remote and rural areas that don't have internet currently at speeds that meet the definition of broadband. And the priority was supposed to be for fiber optic connections on the basis that those offer the fastest speeds and they're the most reliable, but also importantly, that they're capable of offering faster speeds over time. So people often say like fiber is kind of a future proof technology. The thinking being that this internet speeds that we consider like decent are always getting faster. And so if you look back at the speeds that have been considered broadband speeds, 20 years ago, what used to be considered broadband now would be considered insanely slow. And so the idea was that this would be, a massive investment that would really pay off like well into the future.
Without having to like relay massive amounts of infrastructure, it's open to upgrades.
Right. And without having to then go back and have another massive investment 10 years down the line, something like that. That was sort of the thinking.
So then the other side of this, so that's the $42.5 billion broadband program, but your reporting mentions a major shift in how the federal government wants states to evaluate broadband proposals. So what changed?
Yeah, so just a couple of weeks ago, the federal agency that is running this program under the Trump administration put out a policy notice that really kind of rewrites the rules that states are going to use to make this program happen. And obviously, everyone is still kind of trying to figure out what those changes mean. But a lot of people I spoke to said they seem, like a pretty dramatic difference. Probably the biggest difference is that instead of having states give priority to fiber projects, the federal government now wants them to focus on the kind of lowest cost option, like the projects that will want the least subsidy. And the Commerce Secretary has said this is about being, the most efficient and kind of getting the best value for investment, because fiber can be very expensive, especially in really remote areas. But a lot of people that I've spoken to have said, that could be a very short-sighted approach, that's kind of prioritizing what's cheap in the short term over kind of what's the best long-term investment. But like I said, it's only been a couple weeks, and so everyone is still kind of trying to figure out what the new rules mean in practice and what things will look like going forward.
Now, this change in kind of the approach at the federal level, did this change towards this broadband project, did that coincide with the change of administration this year?
Yes, it's very specifically connected to the change in administration. After President Trump took office, it was announced that there would be like a federal review of this program. And so that was going on for a couple of months. And then these changes are kind of the result of that review. And it's worth noting that the priority given to fiber in this program has been something that there has been pushback on for several years, particularly from providers of other kinds of internet technologies like satellite or wireless. And it's not that those technologies were completely excluded from the program before, but now certainly they have, it seems like a much better chance of winning more of this money. This really opens the door for more of the money to flow to them, because in many ways, when cost is the primary factor in awarding the grants, they are likely to be more competitive against fiber.
So, you did speak to advocates and experts on this topic, and you already mentioned that they indicated that this new approach may be relatively short-sighted. Can you tell me more about what they're saying, and what are they saying about the long-term consequences of this approach, prioritizing cost over quality?
Yeah, one thing that a lot of experts really emphasize is that this is getting a lot of attention now, but this program that we're talking about is not the first big investment that the U.S. government has made in trying to make broadband more accessible. There have been a number of very large federal programs, and they've often really fallen short, whether because the standards weren't stringent enough, or because in some cases the focus was on cost over like assessing the reliability of providers, or prioritizing certain technologies. And so I think it's something that, we, with this program in particular, um, really have to see how it plays out. There are definitely questions about how states are going to put these rules into practice, and, what that could look like from state to state. But certainly a lot of people who've been kind of working on this big broadband push were, I would say, like, pretty disappointed and alarmed by these changes.
Yeah, and questions about how they're going to implement the changes at all, that would be understandable. But I'm curious, how are they going to implement these changes when they've already started work on this project under a different set of rules? They've already received and scored applications. So, what happens to all that work now?
Yeah, so the timing is kind of crazy in that this process was already underway, and this kind of makes states not exactly start over, but they have to go back and do another round of applications, and on a very tight timeline. So states now have 90 days to redo an application round with these new rules, decide who will get the money, and then submit that to the federal government. There are also other changes they have to work on as a result of these federal changes. So it's certainly a pretty tight timeline. I know some people I spoke to had doubts about whether states like would realistically be able to get that done. And so it's certainly going to be, an extremely busy couple of months for folks in the broadband office, and also for, internet service providers who want to compete for this money.
So, you talked to the experts about this, but what about the folks on the ground in the Commonwealth? How's this going to affect folks like Karen Vanko, the retired teacher that you spoke with?
Yeah, well, I spoke to her because she lives in a rural area, and she and her husband, they currently have satellite internet through a program that the county started during the pandemic. And she was sort of explaining that, it is an improvement on the DSL connection they had before, and they're certainly grateful to have the help with that. But if she had her choice, she would love to have a fiber connection. She said it would be more reliable, and it would just be kind of like a weight off her mind to have that available. And there is, kind of a tension here that certainly for a lot of folks in rural areas, they feel like this whole process has really been hurry up and wait. They feel like they've been hearing about this broadband money for years, and construction still hasn't begun on any of these networks. On the other hand, from the government's perspective, this is a huge program that takes a lot of planning and coordination to make sure that the money goes where it needs to be. So I think there are certainly questions about, would you rather have a kind of temporary solution sooner, or would you be willing to wait for something that could really be like a long-term investment? But the people who will actually be using the internet networks that are built as a result of this program, at this point, like, they don't necessarily have that much say in what the rules are, or like what the outcomes will be.
And then another party involved with all of this is smaller local internet providers. How are they responding to this shakeup? How are they feeling about it?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a mixed bag. Certainly for some smaller providers who offer like wireless internet, they might be very pleased with these changes that now kind of make them more competitive, or they might consider applying for this money, whereas before they didn't. But certainly, one thing I heard was that, just the process of putting an application in is expensive and time consuming, especially if you're a small company. And so that some of those companies were feeling like, oh God, like, do we have to go through this process again? It's worth noting that they don't necessarily have to reapply. The state has said they will rescore applications they've already received. But in some cases, companies might want to make different proposals because the rules have changed. And so certainly, there's going to be a lot of work to get done. Like we said before, on that pretty tight time frame for companies that want to submit new applications for this.
As you said, the government seems to be prioritizing cost over quality. So, we've got concerns about what quality will the users be getting, but what cost will they be getting too? Will this impact what users are paying?
Yes, it will. Another one of the changes that's been made to the rules for this program is to kind of water down a requirement that internet service providers who get these grants offer like a low cost option. So now that really gets to be defined by the companies, and states really can't like set a benchmark for what that should look like. And certainly, I heard from advocates the concern, that we could be spending a lot of federal money to build these networks, and then folks may not be able to afford to subscribe to them, which is, definitely a concern.
I just want to bring this back. Does this speak to again the motive of why these changes are being done? Because it sounded like earlier you were saying part of this was to open this process up to other companies, to additional companies providing additional services that weren't part of the focus of this originally. And now you're saying that the government's also saying, well, okay, well, you know what, but the companies are the ones that should decide what low cost actually is. It seems like the motivation here, and maybe you can't speak to it, but it seems like the motivation here is to make sure that some companies are going to be able to make some more money here.
Well, I think, what the Trump administration would say is that they want to get this money out faster and more efficiently. And they point to the fact that under the previous administration, there had been years of planning, but not necessarily a ton of shovels in the ground. But certainly there has been a lot of discussion, among advocates and experts and lobbyists that, these changes do seem to benefit companies like, in particular, Starlink, owned by Elon Musk, which will now be able to, as much as it wants to, apply for a lot of new areas that maybe it, previously wouldn't have been able to. So there's definitely been a lot of speculation that these changes, benefit that company in particular. But the administration would say that what's important is not the specific technology that's used, but getting people internet as soon as possible and as efficiently as possible. So I think the full impact of the changes kind of still remains to be seen. And I heard sort of a range of perspectives working on this story, from people really saying, like, the sky is falling and the whole point of this program has been upended, to other people saying, like, whoa there, we won't know how until, to see how this really shakes out. And there are ways that states still, have some leeway here. And that we don't necessarily need to panic. So I think, there's a lot of open questions going forward, and we'll certainly be following closely to see, who ends up getting these grants, and what ultimately ends up happening for folks on the ground who need this service.
Okay, and while we're waiting to see what happens with this, specifically for the Pennsylvanians on the ground in rural areas, what should they be watching for as the Commonwealth rushes to submit a new proposal by early September, which is just months away?
Yeah, well, one thing to watch for is that there will be some areas that previously were eligible for these grants that now will not be. And so that is something to keep an eye on. And also, I think just, the progress of this as the state announces the winners, there will be like a public comment period, I believe, once that's been done. And so, people can keep an eye on that and can submit their comments if they want to be heard. Pennsylvania's Broadband Development Authority also meets fairly regularly, and they always take public comment at those meetings. So, there are certainly opportunities for people to give their input. But in terms of the major rules changes, those have kind of happened now, and it's up to the state to figure out, how to make that happen going forward.
We've been talking to Charlotte Keith, investigative reporter for Spotlight PA, and her work is up now at spotlightpa.org. Charlotte, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you. It was great to talk.